Please join me in welcoming Brian Evenson to the UHV ABR readings.
I'm going to read the title story of the collection, and if there's time, I'll read a little bit more as well. It's called Windeye. 1. They lived when he was growing up in a simple house, an old bungalow with a converted attic and sides covered in cedar shake. In the back, where an oak thrust its branches over the roof, the shake was light brown, almost honey. In the front, where the sun struck it full, it had weathered to a pale gray, like a dirty bone. There, the shingles were brittle, thinned by sun and rain, and if you were careful, you could slip your fingers up behind some of them. Or at least his sister could. He was older and his fingers were thicker, so he could not. Looking back on it many years later, he often thought it had started with that, with her carefully working her fingers up under a shingle as he waited and watched to see if it would crack. That was one of his earliest memories of his sister, if not the earliest. His sister would turn around and smile, her hand gone to knuckles, and say, "I feel something. What am I feeling?" And then he would ask questions. Is it smooth, he might ask? Does it feel rough, scaly? Is it cold-blooded or warm-blooded? Does it feel red? Does it feel like its claws are in or out? Can you feel its eye move? He would keep on, watching the expression on her face change as she tried to make his words into a living, breathing thing, until it started to feel too real to her, and half giggling, half screaming, she whipped her hand free. There were other things they did, other ways they tortured each other, things they both loved and feared. Their mother didn't know anything about it, or if she did, she didn't care. One of them would shut the other inside the toy chest and pretend to leave the room, waiting there silently until the one in the chest couldn't stand it any longer and started to yell. That was a hard game for him because he was afraid of the dark, but he tried not to show that to his sister. Or one of them would wrap the other tight in blankets, and then the trapped one would have to break free. Why they had liked it, why they had done it, he had a hard time remembering later, once he was grown. But they had liked it, or at least he had liked it. There was no denying that. And he had done it, no denying that either. So at first those games, if they were games, and then later something else, something worse, something decisive. What was it again? Why was it so hard, now that he was grown, to remember? What was it called? Oh yes, Windeye. 2. How had it begun, and when? A few years later, when the house started to change for him, when he went from thinking about each bit and piece of it as a separate thing and started thinking of it as a house. His sister was still coming up close, entranced by the gap between shingle and wall, intrigued by the twist and curve of a crack in the concrete steps. It was not that she didn't know there was a house, only that the smaller bits were more important to her than the whole. For him, though, it had begun to be the reverse. So he began to step back, to move back in the yard far enough away to take the whole house in at once. His sister would give him a quizzical look and try to coax him in closer, to get him involved in something small. For a while he'd play down to her level, narrate to her what the surface she was touching or the shadow she was glimpsing might mean, so she could pretend. But over time he drifted out again. There was something about the house as a whole, that troubled him. But why? Wasn't it just like any house? His sister, he saw, was standing beside him, staring at him. He tried to explain it to her, tried to put a finger on what fascinated him. This house, he told her, it's a little different. There's something about it. But he saw from the way she looked at him that she thought it was a game, that he was making it up. What are you seeing? She asked with a grin. Why not, he thought. Why not make it a game? What are you seeing? He asked her. Her grin faltered a little, but she stopped staring at him and stared at the house. I see a house, she said. Is there something wrong with it? He prompted. She nodded, then looked to him for approval. What's wrong? He asked. Her brow tightened like a fist. I don't know, she finally said. The window? What about the window? I want you to do it, she said. It's more fun. He sighed and then pretended to think. Something wrong with the window, he said. Or not the window exactly, but the number of windows. She was smiling, waiting. The problem is the number of windows. There's one more window on the outside than on the inside. He covered his mouth with his hand. She was smiling and nodding, but he couldn't go on with the game. Because yes, that was exactly the problem. There was one more window on the outside than on the inside. That, he knew, was what he'd been trying to see all along. 3. But he had to make sure. He had his sister move from room to room in the house, waving to him from each window. The ground floor was all right, he saw her each time, but in the converted attic just shy of the corner, there was a window at which she never appeared. It was small and round, probably only 1.5 feet in diameter. The glass was dark and wavery. It was held in place by a strip of metal about as thick as his finger, giving the whole of the circumference a dull, leaden rim. He went inside and climbed the stairs, looking for the window himself, but it simply wasn't there. But when he went back outside, there it was. For a time, it felt like he had brought the problem to life himself by stating it, that if he hadn't said anything, the half window wouldn't be there. Was that possible? He didn't think so. That wasn't the way the world worked. But even later, once he was grown, he still found himself wondering sometimes if it was his fault, if it was something he had done, or rather, said. Staring up at the half window, he remembered a story his grandmother had told him back when he was very young, just 3 or 4, just after his father had left and just before his sister was born. Well, he didn't remember it exactly, but he remembered it had to do with windows. Where she came from, his grandmother said, they used to be called not windows, but something else. He couldn't remember the word, but remembered that it started with a V. She had said the word and then had asked, do you know what this means? He shook his head. She repeated the word slower this time. This first part, she had said, means wind. The second part, it means eye. She looked at him with her own pale, steady eye. It is important to know that a window can instead be a Windeye, she said. So he and his sister called it that, Windeye. It was, he told her, how the wind looked into the house, and so it was not a window at all. So of course they couldn't look out of it. It was not a window at all, but a Windeye. He was worried she was going to ask questions, but she didn't. And then they went into the house to look again, to make sure it wasn't a window after all, but it still wasn't there on the inside. Then they decided to get a closer look. They had figured out which window was nearest to it and opened that and leaned out of it. There it was. If they leaned far enough, they could see it and almost touch it. I could reach out, his sister said. If I stand on the sill and you hold my legs, I could lean out and touch it. No, he started to say, but fearless, she had already clambered out onto the sill and was leaning out. He wrapped his arms around her legs to keep her from falling. He was just about to pull her back inside when she leaned farther and he saw her finger touch the Windeye. And then it was as if she had dissolved into smoke and had been sucked into the Windeye. She was gone. 4. It took him a long time to find his mother. She was not inside the house, nor was she outside in the yard. He tried the house next door, the Jorgensens, and then the Allreds, and then the Dunfords. She wasn't anywhere, so he ran back home, breathless, and somehow his mother was there now, lying on the couch, reading. What's wrong? She asked. He tried to explain it best he could. Who? She asked at first, and then said, slow down and tell it again. And then, but who do you mean? And then once he'd explained again, with an odd smile, but you don't have a sister. But of course he had a sister. How could his mother have forgotten? What was wrong? He tried to describe her, to explain what she looked like, but his mother just kept shaking her head. No, she said firmly, you don't have a sister. You never had one. Stop pretending. What's this really about? Which made him feel that he should hold himself very still, that he should be very careful about what he said, that if he breathed wrong, more parts of the world would disappear. After talking and talking, he tried to get his mother to come out and look at the Windeye. Window, you mean, she said, voice rising. No, he said, beginning to grow hysterical as well. Not window, Windeye. And then he had her by the hand and was tugging her to the door. But no, that was wrong too, because no matter which window he pointed at, she could tell him where it was in the house. The Windeye, just like his sister, was no longer there. But he kept insisting it had been there, kept insisting too that he had a sister. And that was when the trouble really started. 5. Over the years, there were moments when he was almost convinced, moments when he almost began to think, and perhaps even did think for weeks or months at a time, that he never had a sister. It would have been easier to think this than to think she had been alive and then, perhaps partly because of him, not alive. Being not alive wasn't like being dead, he felt. It was much, much worse. There were years, too, when he simply didn't choose, when he saw her as both real and make-believe, and sometimes neither of those things. But in the end, what made him keep believing in her, despite the line of doctors that visited him as a child, despite the rift it made between him and his mother, despite years of forced treatment and various drugs that made him feel like his head had been filled with wet sand, despite years of having to pretend to be cured, was simply this. He was the only one who believed his sister was real. If he stopped believing, what hope would there be for her? Thus he found himself, even when his mother was dead and gone, and he himself was old and alone, brooding on his sister, wondering what had become of her. He wondered, too, if one day she would simply reappear, young as ever, ready to continue with the games they had played. Maybe she would simply suddenly be there again, her tiny fingers worked up behind a cedar shingle, staring expectantly at him, waiting for him to tell her what she was feeling, to make up words for what was pressed there between the house and its skin, lying in wait. "What is it?" he would say in a hoarse voice, leaning on his cane. "I feel something," she would say. "What am I feeling?" And he would set about describing it. Does it feel red? Does it feel warm-blooded or cold? Is it round? Is it smooth like glass? All the while he knew he would be thinking not about what he was saying, but about the wind at his back. If he turned around, he would be wondering, would he find the wind's strange, baleful eye staring at him? That wasn't much, but it was the best he could hope for. Chances were he wouldn't get even that. Chances were there would be no sister, no wind. Chances were that he'd be stuck with the life he was living now, just as it was, until the day when he was either dead or not living himself. So that gives you a sense of some of the things I do. I read that one time when my sister was in the room, and very early in the story I talk about, they play this game with the toy box where they lock themselves in and then pretend to leave. And my sister and I used to play that game, and so when I read that part in the story, she just burst out laughing, and which ruined the mood. So my sister is no longer allowed to come to any of my readings. And then afterwards she said, "So, you never wanted to have me as a sister, is that what's going on?" So, I'm going to read just part of another story as well, and just to give you a sense of kind of another sort of thing that I do, and go from there. A lot of stories in this collection are fairly creepy. And this is a story called Enscon House. Actually, I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read a story early on called The Second Boy. This is kind of a ghost story. You'll get a sense of where it's headed, and then I'll end in about 15 minutes. A kind of darkness had swept up very quickly to catch them unaware. The wind rose with it, crusting the snow into ice, the cold become now crisp and hard. As they walked, snow began to fall again until soon Leppin could no longer see the trail. He could hardly see Dirk either, except as a dim shape on its way to being lost. "Hadn't we better stop?" Leppin asked. But Dirk apparently could not make up his mind to do so. He shook his head. There must be still some trace of the trail, and perhaps they were still on it or not too far from it or would find it soon, or perhaps they would soon see a light and be able to make for it. In the wind, Leppin caught only scraps of what the fellow was saying. He trudged on, just behind. The wind rose further, and he could feel his fingers growing numb. He kept walking until he could no longer feel them at all. "It's very cold," he finally said. "We have to stop." At first, Dirk didn't hear him over the wind. Leppin had to hurry his steps and wrap an arm around Dirk's shoulders and shout into his ear. Even after this, there was a moment in which Dirk gave no response. There came a short, curt nod that made Leppin believe he had given in. But no, after Leppin released him, Dirk just kept walking. After a moment, Leppin, not knowing what else to do, followed. The drifts were deep enough that sometimes when the crust of ice broke, Leppin sank to his thigh, the snow underneath powdery and clinging to everything. He could feel the bones ache in his feet, and when that passed, too, he couldn't feel his feet at all. It was hard for him even to remember where he was or who he was. Dirk was a little ahead, back stiff, marching resolutely forward, a vague, withdrawn figure. and then little more than a shadow. And then, as the snow thickened in the air, he was suddenly gone. Leppin called out once, but Dirk didn't hear, or if he did, he didn't stop. Leppin waited, stamping his feet, wondering if Dirk would notice he was gone and double back. When he didn't, Leppin tried to follow. The storm was still growing. In the darkness and cold, he couldn't find Dirk's tracks. He wasn't even sure he was moving in the right direction. He was surprised to notice his body seemed comfortably warm. His face, too, seemed like it might be warm, though he couldn't feel it exactly. Why not just dig out a place for himself in the snow, make a little cave, a little hole, and wait for the storm to pass? Instead, he lurched onward, kept moving. It was as if someone else was walking, not him, a body moving bluntly forward, rudderless, under its own power. He let it go, just trying to stay vaguely connected to it. It went on like that for a while, with Leppin less and less aware of what was happening around him, until he walked into a tree limb, sending a cascade of snow down onto his head. A branch had torn into the side of his neck. Not that he could feel his neck exactly, but there was a wetness there that was different from the other wetness, and a faint smell, too. He was only imagining or making up as he went, since it was too dark to see, and his hands and face were too numb to feel. There were around him other trees as well, he soon found, encountering one and then another and then a third. He struggled his lighter out of his pocket and watched his gloved fingers try to flick at a light, was surprised that they finally managed. He cupped the flame with one hand and saw below him nearly bare ground, almost no snow, a matrix of pine needles and dead vegetation and mud spidered through with veins of frost. He prodded the ground with the toe of his boot. Some places it remained hard, like a single, consistent organism. In others it came slowly apart, the ice not strong enough to hold the dead leaves and other matter together. He kept at it until he found a large spot that was loose and mostly dry, the leaves and needles such that he could push them together into a heap with his boot. From there it was little enough to bring the lighter down among the needles and leaves until they smoldered and, crackling, caught flame. He kept uprooting needles and leaves and adding them to the fire until the flames were high enough for him to start stripping bark off the nearest trees. The underside of the bark was threaded with worm trails. It was also studded with black blotches that, as the bark caught fire, began to unfurl and move, becoming small black vermin that spud madly about before sizzling away. Unless it was just that he was seeing things, parts of his brain going dim and dying from the cold. He tried not to think about this, carefully feeding bigger and bigger chunks of wood onto the fire until he had a roaring blaze. An hour later, he had built a shelter just big enough for him to crawl inside. In the glow of the fire, he could see the trees all around him, but could not tell where the forest ended or where he had come from. He had removed his boots and gloves, and they lay there beside the fire, slowly steaming. Feeling had begun to creep back into his hands and knees, his fingers and toes feeling as though they were being bitten repeatedly by flies. His face throbbed. It felt as though his eyes were scraping against their sockets as they moved. He heaped more fuel onto the fire and then slowly lay back in the shelter, staring at the flames until, almost without knowing, he had fallen asleep. He woke up shivering. The fire he could just see through the entrance of the makeshift shelter had guttered, flickering down to almost nothing. I should get up and keep it going, he thought, but even though he was shivering, he found it very hard to imagine moving. Maybe he slept a little, his eyes slightly open, or maybe almost no time passed at all. But in either case, suddenly he realized that the fire had flared again and he was no longer shivering. Something was shaking him, rocking one of his legs back and forth. He let his eyes fall into focus, and there was Dirk. "How'd you find me?" Leppin asked. "Let me come in," said Dirk. "There's not room in here," said Leppin. "There's only room for one." "Nonsense," said Dirk, and began to push his way up Leppin's legs and in. The shelter itself groaned and threatened to come asunder. Then the boughs and branches to either side simply slipped and settled, leaving the shelter more or less intact. Dirk was pressed against its wall on one side and against Leppin's legs and chest on the other. His body was very cold, and once he was inside, the snow on his coat and trousers began to melt. "Take your wet things off," Leppin said. "It was hard enough to get in here," said Dirk. "That's all I can do."
I'm freezing, said Lepin. All right, said Dirk, just a minute. But he just lay there, not moving. What's wrong with him, wondered Lepin, and then couldn't help but wonder, what's wrong with me? Dirk just lay beside him, not speaking, not moving. Dirk, said Lepin. When Dirk didn't respond, he repeated his name, louder this time. What is it? Dirk whispered, his mouth somewhere close to Lepin's right ear. How did you find me? Said Lepin. What? How did you find me? What's wrong with you? Asked Dirk. What do you mean? Asked Lepin, astonished. I already answered the question, Dirk said. No, you didn't, said Lepin, voice rising. And then, when Dirk didn't answer, he reached over and tapped his forehead. Answer again, he said. I found you, whispered Dirk. Isn't that enough? Enough for what? Wondered Lepin. And then, afraid of it, he let that thought drift slowly away. Tell me a story, said Dirk a little while later, same dull whisper. He was staring up at the ceiling of the shelter, eyes hardly blinking, features difficult to make out in the flickering light. A story? Asked Lepin. About what? While I'm warming up, said Dirk, a story. But I don't know any stories, said Lepin. Get closer to the fire, he said. Leave the shelter and get closer to the fire. That's what will warm you up. In a minute, said Dirk. Lepin waited. Dirk didn't move. Finally, Lepin pushed at him. A story, Dirk said. I don't know any, said Lepin again. I've already told you. There was a long moment of silence. He must have fallen asleep, Lepin thought. He was not shivering now, or hardly. Either Dirk was getting warmer or he was getting used to it. All right, Dirk suddenly said, then I'll tell you one. There was once a little boy lost in a cave, said Dirk. What boy? Asked Lepin, suddenly jumpy. Did he have a name? What was this cave? It doesn't matter what boy, said Dirk, or in a way it does. Which boy, anyway. But his name doesn't matter at all, and the place doesn't matter at all either, beyond there being a cave. Why not? Said Lepin. Dirk tilted his head halfway toward him. This, somehow, made Lepin nervous. Very little ever actually matters, Dirk said. That's just the way it is. There was once a boy lost in a cave, or rather a crevasse. He had been up in the mountains with the second boy and had slipped and fallen. The second boy ran the few miles back to town and came back with help. By the time they had returned, it was dark. At first, they couldn't find the crevasse. The second boy, panicked, had failed to note the way, and none of the residents of the town had ever seen or heard of a crevasse where the boy said he had been. The second boy kept searching without finding anything. The region, it might be worth mentioning, was harsh, of an austere harshness. Through that curious acoustical quality that dry-aired mountainous regions sometimes possess, the second boy, whose ears were better than those of the adults he had brought with him, could hear the faint cries of the other boy, but he could not tell from where these cries came. Indeed, to him they seemed to come from everywhere at once. He kept starting out in a direction and then hesitating, moving off in an altogether different direction. Can't you hear it? He kept asking his rescuers. Can't you hear him? But none of them could. After a while, he began to wonder if the cries he was hearing were the boy after all, if they weren't rather the wind, or worse, simply a noise existing only within the confines of his own skull. After half a night of this, almost all the rescuers gave up and went home to rest, planning to resume the search in the morning. The only one left was a large, quiet man, dark-haired, with thick, dark lips and a brooding stare, who was rumored to have a predilection for young boys. What kind of story is this? Lepin blurted out. You'll see, said Dirk, turning a little farther towards him and giving a blue-lipped smile. You'll see. The man stood there, a coil of rope hanging from his shoulder, watching the second boy come and go. Eventually he sat down and started a fire. When the second boy passed yet again, the man patted the ground next to him and said, Sit down, take a moment, think about other things, then maybe you'll know where he is. So the second boy did. Knowing the man, he didn't sit too close to him, but instead on the opposite side of the fire. He might simply have run off to search on his own, except that the man had a rope. If he were ever to find the crevasse, he would need the rope to climb down to search for his friend. What, asked the man, would you like to talk about? The boy just stayed squatting on the other side of the fire, not saying a thing. Tell me a story, then, the man said. The second boy looked into the fire, then looked into the darkness. He could still hear, faintly, the cries of his friend. I don't know any, the boy finally said. Of course you do, said the man. Everybody knows a story. Lepin, listening, felt suddenly very afraid. Then I'll tell you one, said Dirk, said the man in Dirk's story, the story he was telling to Lepin. Stop, said Lepin, but Dirk didn't stop. I don't know exactly what he told, Dirk said, his voice stronger now. I suppose it really doesn't matter. What matters is that it was a story that wormed its way slowly under the second boy's skin. It felt as though, even though he was hearing it for the first time, he had heard it before. There was a slow inexorability to it, the sense that it was a story moving steadily closer to something that would be very bad ever to reach. There are some things I know about the story, scattered bits and fragments that may or may not make much sense to a listener. In it there was a man with pudgy fingers who at a crucial moment rolled slowly out of a cane-backed chair, dead. There was a man who held a mirror flat in his palm and regarded his surroundings only in their reflections. There was a small, withered creature, maybe a hairless monkey, maybe a sort of extremely small and very old woman, whom another, larger, hairless monkey or withered crone carried around like a doll, whispering to it from time to time something that sounded like, I saw the devil, all red, all red. And saying this, the man reached his hand toward the boy. As soon as he saw the storyteller stretch forth his hand, the second boy felt the story had come altogether too close to arriving at that place it would be very bad to reach, and rushed off into the darkness. The man, surprised, went after him, shouting, or so it seemed to the second boy. All red, he kept thinking, his heart beating fast, all red. And it was precisely then, when it was furthest from his thoughts, that he managed to run directly to the chasm. Even in the darkness, he knew he had found it at last. A moment later, there was the man, wheezing. Here it is, the second boy simply said. Leaning over to catch his breath, hands on his knees, the man simply nodded. Then he traced his way back to the fire, got his coil of rope, and took a burning branch off the flames. He returned, using the boy's cries, the second boy's cries this time, to guide him. It was hardly a crevasse or a chasm or a cave at all, though perhaps the man realized it seemed that way to the boy. It was more a rip, a tear in the ground, partly hidden by the bushes, a fact that surely explained how the first boy had failed to see it and had fallen in. Properly speaking, it was just a hole. Why are you telling me this? Asked Lepin. The man, Dirk continued, tied the rope around the bole of a scraggly tree and unfurled its coil down the hole. And then he climbed in, holding on to the burning branch and the rope at the same time. There was a short drop and then a steady slope. This much the second boy could see from the top of the hole. And then the man disappeared from sight, the light within the hole slowly vanishing. Who knows how long the second boy waited at the top of the hole in the cold, the quiet, the dark. For a long time he stared down into the hole's darkness. Then he lay on his back, hands and feet aching from cold, and stared up into the dark at the whirl of stars above. Perhaps he closed his eyes and slept a little, perhaps not. But finally there came a noise and a light, and when he looked again, he saw, revealed in the light of a single match struck below, the dim form of the man carrying, slung over one shoulder, the body of the first boy. Is he alive? The second boy called down. Yes, the man claimed. He would, he said, tie the boy to the end of the rope and leave him lying on the ground. Then he would climb up himself, and together they would haul the first boy to safety, which they did. Once they had, they built a fire. And only then did the second boy discover that the boy they had drawn hand over hand out of the chasm was not the boy who had fallen in, but a boy he had never seen before. It goes on, but I'll stop there. Thanks very much.